Hey, what's going on, guys? This is the Leafs Convo podcast presented by Vanguard Northeast Realty in Scarborough, vanguardne.ca. I'm Norman James in London, Ontario, joined as always by Mike Augello in Cheektowaga, New York. Mr. A, how are you?
Hi, Norm. I am well, although the weather in Western New York is depressing and dreary, but I'm sure that everybody in Toronto right now is enthused by the success of their basketball team and maybe in the future the success of their hockey team.
Yeah, let's hope so. Don't forget the underlings to the Maple Leafs are pretty damn successful, and they're venturing into the third round against the Charlotte Checkers. Mike, it is the 6th anniversary of the meltdown in Boston. We'll get to that in just a little bit, but Mike Babcock, much to the chagrin of a lot of Leaf fans, will be back as head coach of the Maple Leafs for 1920. In terms of his coaching buddies, he may have to find some new ones, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's been out there for a little while that DJ Smith is on the radar for at least 2 and maybe 3 teams in terms of head coaching positions. I know that that the Leafs gave the Ottawa Senators permission to talk to Smith about their head coaching job. There was some speculation that Ken Holland, who just took over in Edmonton, might be interested in interviewing if they don't land Dave Tippett, who apparently is the leading candidate for the Oilers job. And Smith's name has been mentioned as possibly in connection with Buffalo. But, he's getting some feelers out there. There's no guarantee he's going to get any one of those 3 jobs. And if he doesn't, then he probably comes back. But sounds like there's going to be some changes to Babcock's staff. Jim Hiller, who's been his assistant since he was hired in 2015, he has basically been given permission to talk to anybody in the league, and the speculation is that he won't be back.
Would Sheldon Keefe be a viable option for any of these teams?
As for him being a viable option for an assistant coach with the Leafs, I think absolutely not. I think if he stays with the Leafs organization, it'll still be as the Marlies head coach. There has been some talk about Buffalo having interest in Keefe. But Elliot Friedman said it best. He mentioned on his 31 Thoughts podcast last week that if Keefe is leaving Toronto, it's not going to be for Buffalo. I mean, Buffalo is pretty much a train wreck on the level of Edmonton and Ottawa, going through coaches every 2 years. And why wouldn't Keefe on a new contract wait a year or 2 until, Mike more than likely Mike Babcock is not finishing out the full 8 years of his deal. I don't know if he has some success, he could if he wanted to, but and then Keefe could go someplace else, especially if he wins 2 Calder Cups in a row. But I don't think Buffalo is a good option for him. And if there's other jobs out there that really hit a home run, then maybe he goes. But I think he's going to stay with Toronto. But there is some interest out there in Keefe.
Are you telling me Mike Babcock senses the end is coming for him, perhaps prematurely, when weighted against his contract?
Well, I mean, I think he's realistic in the sense that, the first year was the tank year, and that doesn't really count. But 3 years in a row, the team has had first-round exits, Washington and now Boston 2 years in a row. This is a results-oriented business, and I don't think they're looking to fire him right away. I think they're looking for him to have the success that they thought there was going to be when they hired him. So if it does happen, then I think he continues. He was left hanging out a bit after the end of the season press conference. I think that was on purpose. I think that, there was a message being sent that, you're not an untouchable. You're going to have to adjust to the times. You're going to have to do certain things. And one of those things is win in the playoffs. And if he can't get this team to win in the playoffs, then somebody else will.
We were going on all season long about the Leafs' deficiencies and how the team wasn't necessarily set up personnel-wise to optimize success. How can we look back now and go, well, Mike Babcock didn't get the job done?
Well, I think it's more than just Babcock. You can't lay the lack of success last season all on him. I mean, the time aspect of Austin Matthews and other players playing Zach Hyman on a torn ACL. I mean, all those things that happened in the playoffs, those are factors that he has to own. But again, this roster was not good enough. It was clear from the very beginning of the season that the defense wasn't good enough. Dubas tried to address that with the addition of Muzzin, but they needed a right shot. They couldn't get any more defenders. Then they had defensemen hurt in Dermott and Gardner. And we can see from what, with Dermott going out with a shoulder surgery and being out for 6 months, I mean, that we know that it was a serious injury. And we look at the Leafs defense going into next season. We don't know what they're going to do in terms of trade or free agent signing or what, but, Gardner is probably gone. Hainsey, we don't know about. Dermott will be out at least the first month of the season. There's going to be a lot of changes on the blue line.
I'm interested to see what happens, and I've mentioned this on previous podcasts, with Kyle Dubas and his transactional process during the summer months. Does he make a splash? Does he do something bold to recoup defensive help? Or does he essentially stay the course, save a couple of minor deals to plug a few holes here and there, and just let Mike Babcock fend for himself with the roster that Kyle Dubas believes is appropriate for the time being, a roster that his buddy Sheldon Keefe will take over at some point?
Well, and this may be overstated because I've heard a few media members mention this, but I think it's worth mentioning again, is that, Dubas is, he's been made aware and he's recognized, what Masai Ujiri has done with the Raptors. And obviously, he fired a coach of the year. And he traded the team's best player for a better player in Kawhi Leonard. And you see the results of what happened with the Raptors winning on Sunday. That, communicates to him that bold moves sometimes can be difference-making moves. The question is whether you can make the right bold move. And there's no guarantee that Dubas is going to do this. If he doesn't see a deal out there that is beneficial to this team, then he's going to stay with what he's got. But I think that especially in this season, with a number of teams having upset losses in the first round of the playoffs and teams looking to make changes and the salary cap being a factor, I think those deals are out there. And we know that this team is in a position of strength when it comes to players up front, and is not in a position of strength when it comes on players on the blue line. And I think until they address that, this team will continue to have problems when it counts in the playoffs.
There is a belief that, Mike Babcock's been read the Riot Act and that he could be on borrowed time. To make a deal to help further Mike Babcock's success while sending a message that you're not going to be my guy for the full term doesn't make a lot of sense. And we know that Kyle Dubas is extremely calculated. Do you think Mike Babcock will have any say whatsoever in who joins his coaching staff, provided Jim Hiller leaves and DJ Smith takes off too?
I think he'll have almost complete control of his coaching staff. That's I don't know whether that's written in the words of his contract, but I don't think, this is not a Randy Carlisle situation where you bring in his assistant coaches who the ones that he brought in were let go, and the ones that were brought in after that, Peter Horachek and I think it was Steve Spott, I don't think they were his choices. So I don't think that that's going to happen. And honestly, I don't think Kyle Dubas is going to go down the road of not pulling the trigger on something that'll be beneficial to the team because Mike Babcock is the head coach. I think that Kyle Dubas's reputation is tied into the success or failure of this team, and be damned if it's Babcock or if it's Sheldon Keefe. This team has got to win. And I made the comparative in my column today. It's like, you have the Raptors winning yesterday and everybody euphoric in Jurassic Park in Toronto, and the Blue Jays winning getting to the ALCS 2 consecutive years in 2015 and 2016. Though the reaction to those events would be dwarfed by what happened if Austin Matthews scored an overtime goal in Game 7. And that's the task in front of Kyle Dubas, because this fan base is getting sick of waiting. I think they're fed up. I think they were excited by the addition of Tavares. Now they want this team to win, and it's not that easy. But Dubas has to find a way to make this team better.
Tavares scored 45 goals in the regular season and did all he could in the playoffs, playing against the best line in hockey. So Johnny T has paid it for his massive contract through production, and I Don't see any reason why he won't continue to do so. It's Mike Babcock's fault in a lot of ways the Leafs lost Game 7, but it's the team's fault they lost Game 6. Babcock is the guy on the hot seat now. There's an expectation. It's win or you're done. This dynamic with Babcock as the head coach and Sheldon Keefe laying in wait, peculiar.
Well, I don't think it's going to force Babcock into doing something that he doesn't want to do because, as I think we've said on previous shows, if he gets fired by the Leafs or if he decides to quit in the middle of his contract, whatever however the situation plays out, if he wants to coach again, he will, because he'll be, look at some of the coaches that are being talked about and being possibly hired, Jacques Martin, Ralph Kruger, Dave Tippett. I mean, this is a league. This guy has won a Stanley Cup and 2 Olympic gold medals. He's going to get another job. So, I mean, it's simply with Sheldon Keefe, he's the coach in waiting. I think, we've known that for a while. I don't think it's going to really affect and force Babcock to do something he doesn't want to do. It's just a reality. But I think there's pressure on him. There's pressure on Dubas. If somebody's going to go down the line, it'll probably be Babcock first. But that's not surprising. The general manager has got the run of the organization. He's got the confidence of the board and the team president. And that's the way it's going to go. It's just a question of when and if they have success before then or if they don't. And
Babcock's going to be paid every red cent that is owed to him. Here's a question for listeners. If Sheldon Keefe has the exact same team as Mike Babcock this coming season, the same firepower up front, but not a lot of acquired help on defense, with guys like Timothy Liljegren and Rasmus Sandin potentially getting a kick at the can, does he do any better?
There is a level of communication that maybe being a younger coach would be better from Keefe than from Babcock. I mean, Babcock definitely is somebody who believes in his plan, and we've seen the inflexibility of Babcock in certain game situations. But for all those things, you have the experience of Babcock as opposed to the NHL inexperience of Sheldon Keefe. So there's going to be a give and take there. So, I mean, I don't think the Leafs are in any rush to push Babcock out. They're just in a rush for results.
Sure, I agree.
And I think that they see the fact that, there were some things based on Babcock's lack of flexibility that did not contribute to their victory in that series, but contributed to their defeat. And I think that they want to try to nip that in the bud and try to get him to be more flexible.
Babcock was a mess coaching in Game 7, and he compounded that disaster with his defensive postseason press conference. But Mike Babcock has we talk about this guy like he should be put out to pasture. I mean, the guy is one of the great coaches of our generation. He's only won 1 Stanley Cup, but he's been to several finals, and his record is incredible. So we've got to give the guy some credit, and we've got to give the guy a little bit of leniency and a little extra rope to try to make something happen. I feel the dynamic is a bit odd, but if there is a sense that Mike Babcock might be rounding third base on his tenure with the Maple Leafs, and it's put up or shut up time, and he understands that, then so be it there, Mike. 6 years to the day of the collapse in Boston, 2013, the Leafs were up 4-1, and it looked like they were going to move on through against the Bruins. I remember Nazem Kadri scoring a goal in that Game 7 back in 2013. Boston just didn't look like they were going to be able to get back into this thing. And then it all changed. Now we're talking about something that happened 6 years ago. Clearly it's the anniversary of it. But the Leafs have lost to the Bruins twice since. Not in as spectacular fashion, but they've been 3 Game 7s with this team and weren't able to get the job done.
When I tweeted this out, because I was making a little bit of a comparative between the euphoria and the ecstasy of, the Toronto fans, the Raptors game, and then going the opposite direction of the agony of the anniversary of that dreaded game in 2013. And honestly, the person who responded to me says, why'd you have to bring that up? I says, well, because it's relevant, because this team has not won since they've gone through a rebuild. There's only two players, and will soon be one after Jake Gardner leaves in free agency. But Kadri and Gardner are the only two members of that 2013 team that are still on this roster. But it's the fact that this team has lost to essentially the same team, the same Bruin team with the same core, twice more with Rask and Bergeron and Marchand, those guys. They've lost to them twice. And the problems of them in Game 7 and not hosting the Game 7 instead of being on the road. All these things are relevant to where this team is now. And until they win around, until they have some success in the postseason, you will continue to dwell over that painful loss 6 years ago. It's like Bartman and the Cubs.
It was a one-off, Mike. It was an aberration as well, because prior to 2013, the Leafs hadn't made the playoffs since 2004 pre-lockout. And then they didn't make the playoffs again until 2017. It almost felt out of place. And then the season after, the Leafs had 90 points with about a month and a bit to go. And they totally, it was an 18-wheeler going right off the cliff. Randy Carlyle lost his job. Mike, it does have impact. These scars are deep for many people. And the Leafs have had two chances to beat the Bruins since, and went to Game 7 in both situations and still have not been able to get over the hump. And people might think that one doesn't have to do with the other, but you know what? When you keep hitting that roadblock at the same point of the playoffs, and sometimes the same fashion, they all have something to do with one another. Real quick, Marlies checkers. What are you expecting out of Sheldon Keefe's Marlies? Just more of the same?
Well, first two games are on the road. It would be surprising if this team can continue being undefeated in the playoffs. They're 7-0 right now. Charlotte's had a pretty good regular season and played very well in the playoffs. The one benefit for the Marlies is that Charlotte's parent club, at least right now, are alive in the playoffs. They're and a number of their players that would be on the checkers are on either Black Aces or playing with the Hurricanes against the Bruins. So early on in that series, that may be an advantage for the Marlies. But if Carolina does lose, then they'll get replenished with a couple players, and they'll be a very tough opponent for the Marlies. The other question is whether Calle Rosen will be back. He was hurt in Game 1 of the series against Cleveland, and they said he would miss the entire series against Cleveland. But now with another week off, we'll see if he comes back. Maybe not, because it was a shoulder injury, and maybe they'll just be careful with it and not rush him back, because he's somebody who the Leafs probably will have to play on their blue line next October.
Here's a serious question, Mike, and I know a lot of our listeners would like to get to the bottom of it. Are you more of a checker or a Black Ace?
I'm neither.
Real quick before we go, DJ Olenek, my Russian brother from another mother, big-time listener of the podcast, whether on podcast or on the YouTube channel, wants to know why a team doesn't just pay a fourth liner to completely rid the earth of Brad Marchand. This, Marchand, the rat, everybody hates his guts, man, but the guy, he's still playing, And if we were on the Leafs, I'm sure we'd find ways to make sense of what he does.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, as a fan looking at it from the outside in, you would like to say, hey, like if you were playing the San Jose Sharks in the Stanley Cup final and you have Michael Haley, who's, a $650,000 fourth line guy who's disposable, go out there and run Brad Marchand into the boards. Problem is that Michael Haley will have to eat the 40-game suspension that he'll get for doing it. So it's not going to happen. If you can hit him clean, and it's possible, then I'm sure most NHL players will applaud you, because he's a reviled character, but he's also one of the best players in this league. He just is just annoying because he's so good, and because he's so good at being a rat.
Now we know how the rest of the league felt when Darcy Tucker was running around out there. Sideshow Bob, he was nowhere near as offensively gifted as Brad Marchand, but he was diminutive, and in a lot of ways he was tougher. So, he was on the Leafs, Darcy Tucker, and we loved him. You know what? If the Leafs had a player like that, some fans wouldn't have the stomach for him, but a lot of other fans would grin and bear it. And if he helped the Leafs finally conquer Mount Boston or the first round for once and move on to the second round of the Stanley Cup playoffs, I think we could deal with it. Mr. Augello, we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Norm.
We would like to thank Vanguard Northeast Realty in Scarborough, title sponsor of the Leafs Convo, demonstrating passion for the industry and a superior level of excellence in selling, leasing, and marketing your property. Vanguard Northeast Realty.